I forgot to make an intro, so here you go. So let's jump right into it. Week 1, we had the home teams were the DC Defenders, Houston Roughnecks, New York Guardians, and the Dallas Renegades. For the first ever game of the XFL, the DC Defenders pulled in 17,100 fans, roughly around there. Numbers may vary depending on which source you go to. This is a decent number, it filled up the stadium enough. And the Houston Roughnecks saw 17,800 fans, and that was pretty good too. And the New York Guardians in MetLife Stadium saw 17,600 fans, and finally the Dallas Renegades saw 17,200 fans. If we look at these numbers, they're all pretty okay, all even number of fans across the field, but if we look at the fans in comparison to the size of the stadium they had, this is where problems arise. MetLife Stadium has a capacity of about 80,000, and they could really only fill just a little bit of that, so that didn't look too great on TV. Audi Field, because it's a smaller stadium, it looked a lot better. Houston, they were about mid-size, playing at TD-ECU Stadium. They fit quite well, and the Dallas Renegades had 17,000 fans, and so they were a little below half attendance. The only major problem is the New York Guardians were like a triple XL on a small body, but that'll as the season progresses on. Now week two, there was really a general trend downwards in fan attendance. If we look at it, the DC Defenders went down to 15,000 fans, which in Audi Field it was still okay attendance, but over the grand scheme of things, those numbers need to stay up. The Seattle Dragons had their first home game in week 2 and saw nearly 30,000 fans show up in attendance, which is really, really good. That's about half the capacity of Century League Field. We'll get into that a little later. Then the Dallas Renegades faced off against the Los Angeles Wildcats at home for the in LA. They fought in LA, and they didn't even pass 15,000 fans in capacity. And finally, the Houston Roughnecks in TD-ECU Stadium had 17,000 fans as well. So as we can see, Houston went down ever so slightly, and Los Angeles has had, so far, just in week 2, the lowest attendance out of any team, and it's their first game at home. Seattle absolutely knocked it away with nearly 30,000 fans in attendance. Now week 3 looks a bit different for several reasons that I'm about to show you. The Houston Roughnecks played the Tampa Bay Vipers in their first home game at Tampa Bay with 18,000 fans in attendance. That was a pretty solid starter number, but we'll get to Raymond James Stadium a little later. And then Dallas was at Seattle. Now, the big thing is when they played Seattle in week 3, the attendance dropped down to 22,000 fans, which is, approximately 8,000 people just didn't show up for week 3. And then St. Louis had their first game at home, which had also nearly 30,000 fans in attendance. And this is the big thing. Los Angeles, the Wildcats, it was their second home game, and they fell to only 12,000 fans in attendance. These numbers only get worse for the Wildcats. In week 4, we had the New York Guardians at home in MetLife Stadium, St. Louis at home, the Dallas Renegades at home, and Tampa Bay Vipers. So in New York, the fan attendance has just absolutely fell out of the bottom. MetLife Stadium only had 12,000 fans show up. In St. Louis, 30,000 fans, they had 27,000 fans. That's still a pretty great number to have. Then Houston Roughnecks played the Dallas Renegades. They had 18,000 fans week 4, which is still pretty great. and Tampa Bay Vipers. Their week 3 performance was pretty great, but week 4, in just 1 week, they had only 12,000 fans, which is rivaling the Los Angeles Wildcats for most attendance. Now, this is fairly important because week 4 we start seeing who has the best attendance in their city. Finally, in week 5, the games were played in Houston, Dallas, DC, and LA. Houston fan base had about 20,000 fans in attendance. The Dallas Renegades had their fans at about 15,000 fans, and DC had about 16,000 fans at home, and LA bringing up the rear, 12,000 fans. So to put all that statistics into perspective, the best fan attendance was by the St. Louis Battlehawks and the Seattle Dragons, both with over 29,000 fans in attendance. Week 6 was supposed to see the Battlehawks fan attendance with over 50,000 fans in St. Louis. McDonald's was even sponsoring the St. Louis Battlehawks, so this was really, really good for the XFL. However, they had 3 main issues, and these were all fairly big. Tampa Bay, New York, and LA. New York and LA, the 2 biggest metropolises in America, had the 2 worst fan experiences in the XFL. And Tampa Bay really brought up the rear as well. But here's some things to think about and ponder. New York had an okay team, and their attendance was okay during the time that their team was okay. Now, whenever Matt McGloin just quit on the team all of a sudden, we saw a major drop-off of New York attendance. You see, in week 1, they had 17,000 fans, and in week 4, they were at 12,000 fans, and that was really at the height of the Matt McGloin drama going on. LA is just not a football city. We've seen it with the LA Rams and the LA Chargers. There was one game I was watching this season. The LA Chargers were playing the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the Pittsburgh Steelers had more fans in attendance than the LA Chargers did, which is hilarious for me. I love seeing teams have opposite fan bases in the home stadium. It's just funny to watch. But for LA, it's really, really not good because they need these major ticket sales. The XFL wasn't really making any money off of viewership because it's a supplemental football team. However, the teams were good enough, and the fans were okay for certain cities. Houston, Dallas, and Washington, D.C. had decent enough fan attendance. Houston's attendance was actually going up, while Washington, D.C. was going up and down with their attendance, and Dallas was actually trending downwards. But finally, we get to the big two, which was the St. Louis Battlehawks and the Seattle Dragons. Now, these two had just amazing fan teams, with the Seattle Dragons showing up with nearly 30,000 on the first game, and they filled up that entire bottom section. However, the attendance did drop down substantially as the season progressed onward. Here's the thing, though. The St. Louis Battlehawks, their team was getting better, and more fans were showing up more often, which was really, really good for their numbers. But as we know, the COVID-19 stuff came and canceled the rest of the XFL season, which leaves everyone to wonder, where would the XFL relocate to? And I think I have an answer to that question. If we look at the AAF, the Orlando Apollos had, an average attendance of about 20,000 fans, which was decent enough. And in Orlando, they announced that they were going to Orlando before the XFL announced their cities, which would probably leave the XFL to move to Orlando instead of where they went to instead of Tampa Bay. Orlando has a couple nice stadiums. They have a good soccer stadium. They also have Camping World Stadium. The AAF played in Camping World Stadium, and it was still a bit too big. I would suggest that the XFL play in Orlando FC's stadium, Explorer Stadium. Now, Explorer Stadium has just an absolutely beautiful facility with the grass field, nice logo, and I love just the color of the stadium. It's a very beautiful stadium, and I absolutely love it. Now the big question is, where do we move LA and New York? Well, for New York, I was thinking we could move them to Columbus, Ohio. Some of the TV ratings showed that Columbus, Ohio had some of the best interest in the XFL. Some of that has to do with, Cardell Jones being with the Defenders. However, because of bad attendance, we can move the New York Guardians over there. I was thinking move the New York Guardians over to the brand new stadium, New Columbus Crew Stadium. It's got a capacity of about 20,000 people, and the inside is just very nice interior. And since it's a soccer stadium, it's going to have, the general amount of people that we need. Now, if they sell out the stadium, we can always move up. They've got Ohio State Buckeye Stadium, but I don't think we'd have to go that drastic of a sizing. Lastly, we have the LA Wildcats. Now, the big question for LA is, where do we move LA? We have two teams that just recently left LA. The Oakland Raiders, now the Las Vegas Raiders, and the San Diego Chargers, which are now the LA Chargers. Now, the big thing is, LA is not a good football city. However, both Oakland and San Diego were great cities for the NFL teams that they held. But neither team really has an NFL football designated stadium. If we go to San Diego has Petco Life, but they don't have a soccer team, and they recently demolished Snapdragon Stadium. San Diego State football is building a new stadium there, however, which looks to have around 30,000 people capacity, and I think that could be a very good option. The new Aztec Stadium in San Diego. The other option is to go to Oakland. Now, Oakland just recently lost their team, the Raiders. Now, in Oakland, you have two options. You can play at the crumbling Coliseum, or you can go a little north to the California Bears Stadium. California has about 60,000 capacity in the California Bears stadium. It is a nice stadium as well. It's not, leaking with sewage problems everywhere, and I think it's a nice option. And if they were to be smart, they would explore both options, Oakland and San Diego. Now, both teams are a bit of a gamble because in San Diego they had the San Diego Fleet, which did not have the greatest of fan attendance behind it. Also, the AAF lied about numbers, and so the numbers, if you look up San Diego Fleet, might not be the most accurate in the world. And I think with Oakland losing its team to Las Vegas, I think if the LA Wildcats moved up to Oakland, that could be a valuable option for them, and I think Oakland would definitely show up for games. Now, there's just two problems with both cities. One, San Diego doesn't really have a football-specific field until San Diego State finishes construction on theirs. And Oakland, they have the nearby San Francisco 49ers, which both teams would be great. And I think a fan base would flourish for either side. Oakland is where I would personally go because of the Oakland Coliseum, and you could just ask the city to demolish part of it and help with that. But Oakland City has had a couple financial problems. They lose a lot of money each year just to keep the city running. But in San Diego, they have to wait for San Diego State to finish completion of their stadium and then approve an XFL team there. So there's a lot of different options that the XFL could explore for the LA team. Finally, we have one of the strangest city relocations in my list. We talked about all the teams with bad fan attendance. We talked about LA and the New York Guardians and the Tampa Bay Vipers, but lastly we have a problem with Houston. Now I live in Houston and I'm an avid fan of the Houston Roughnecks. However, there's one big problem. There's now the Houston Gamblers. And if the USFL succeeds, then Houston's gonna probably need to relocate because the fans will grab onto the Gamblers' history just like they grabbed onto the Houston Roughnecks. And the big thing is, if a city has like more than 2 football teams, NFL and XFL, then they don't tend to care anymore. And I think teams that are going to have the Houston Roughnecks and the Gamblers and the NFL Texans, it's just not going to have the greatest fan attendance in the world. So I think we should move the Houston Texans to Omaha, Nebraska. Now, for a little bit of context, Omaha, Nebraska had the Nighthawks, the Omaha Nighthawks with the UFL. This was probably the best team attendance out of all the different teams in the UFL. They had a couple teams, but out of all of them, Omaha, Nebraska had some of the most fans show up. They had about 20,000 in an average attendance, and they played in a baseball stadium, but I think that's perfectly fine. It fit in everything, and stands weren't too terribly weird, which is why I say we should move the Houston Roughnecks to Omaha. Another thing is the Houston Roughnecks don't have a logo right now, and so if they desperately need it, they could change the logo to something native to Omaha, Nebraska territory, which I think would be a decently smart move. And if fans don't show up, then that would be my weird guess. The other thing is we have the San Antonio Commanders that had about 30,000 people show up for each game, and where I would move the Dallas team is to San Antonio. That way we know we can have a sure bet in San Antonio. And with the XFL announcing that they're going to move a team to San Antonio, I think that these might be some key locations that they might want to consider. But I know, in my many years of expertise in XFL and USFL fan attendance ratings, my opinion isn't too valuable in this sort of thing. However, with the city of San Antonio getting an XFL team, that's going to solidify 3 major teams which I believe are going to have major fan attendance, assuming St. Louis and Seattle and San Antonio all have, great fan attendance. But saying this had made me realize, if you want a successful team in the XFL, you need to put it in a team that has an S at the very beginning of it. And then you're gonna have amazing fan attendance. That's all I really have for you today. You can take my word with a grain of salt, but give this to The Rock, send it to him. That'd make me happy. But I love y'all, and I will see you next time. Later.